agenda today. We're going to quickly touch upon some session goals. Then we're going to talk about how strategy plays a role in governance. So the title of this is really strategic governance. But what I want to do is take it from the strategic level down to some use cases, down to the implementation level. So we're going to talk about firstly how strategy plays a role in governance. Then we're going to talk a little bit around what is governance in Microsoft 365 and MS Teams. What are some of those options, some of those knobs, some of those configuration options that you can use to enforce governance? And strangely enough, one of the things that I see a lot is people don't really understand just how much control you have in terms of governance broadly in the Microsoft 365 space, but especially around Teams. There's a lot of options, there's a lot of capabilities, settings, and policies that you can apply. So we're going to talk about broadly what those are, and then what we're going to do is get into what we call pragmatic governance examples. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this use case driven. So we're going to have 3 different companies, one called Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp is going to be an organization that wants their governance very locked down. One called Balanced Industries, who wants to have a bit of a balanced governance approach. And another one called Startup Inc., who wants basically to open everything up. So we're going to talk about particular scenarios of how you would implement governance for those 3 different organizations. And I find this is really useful because it will actually show you how you can implement governance in Teams, both around things like apps, meetings, who can create teams, meeting policies, securities, a whole bunch of other good stuff as well. Now, before you spend too much time here and maybe realize halfway through that this session isn't really what you're after, let's talk about a little bit some session goals. So first thing what I want to get across during this is talk broadly what governance is and what it entails. I think one of the big struggles that most organizations have that we work with, governance is such a big topic, it can be difficult to communicate exactly what it is. So let's first start and level set exactly what governance can be in Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365. The next thing what we're going to do is educate you on some of the out-of-the-box capabilities that Microsoft 365 provides. Like I said, there's a lot there, not just in the Teams Admin Center, but some of it's also in SharePoint, some of it's in Azure AD, some of it's in some other admin centers within the M365 ecosystem also, but giving you a really good understanding of what are the types of options that are out there. And because they're out of the box, you can go and implement them, you can change them, and all of this, of course, is supported by Microsoft. Then what we're going to do is show you particular scenarios. So we're going to go into this use case scenario based approach of how you can actually implement governance. You know, I find a lot of these sessions, people talk about governance in a very high level strategic sort of manner, which we are going to, but I find really the best way to learn is to talk about, well, how do we take some of these strategic pieces and actually implement them down? So we're going to go through all of that today. And really what I would love for you to get out of this session is to provide some tangible examples, right? That's what I like when I spend some time listening to people talk, something that I can take back to my organization, use straight away. So I'm really hoping you're going to get that out of this session today. So first thing, let's talk about governance and strategy in Teams and Microsoft 365. So from a strategic perspective, what does governance involve? Broadly, the way that I like to look at governance and the way that we communicate it to our customers is governance really should be there to drive adoption, right? Your goal should be a dynamic, frictionless service for users with a robust management. So when you're talking about governance, really the idea is not to lock everything down, but to make sure that you have a really good balance between the policies, the responsibilities, the roles that you need within your organization to make that happen. And also enough from the end user side that not everything gets locked down. Now, in terms of what actually governance is that process. It's that process of defining people and processes and rules and structures, in this case in Microsoft Teams, but of course it can also apply to other parts of Microsoft 365, maybe SharePoint, maybe something like Yammer and everything else. In terms of what a typical governance plan involves, when we see organizations and we work with organizations create governance plans, these are the typical things that you might be looking for. So the first thing is around roles. So making sure you're defining different responsibilities for different use cases. So things like IT and end users and admins, defining those roles concretely and also defining responsibilities for each one of those roles. The next thing that you also want to do is focus on some processes and make sure that you have an understanding of who is going to be responsible for those processes, who can execute them, and the roles who are going to be performing those as well. So this could be things like the team creation process, the team's archival process, who can create and book meetings, for instance. You want to talk about access and ownership, and finally policies as well. So any policies that you need for managing content within a team. So things like taxonomy or metadata, labeling, or data loss protection also. In terms of why you should spend time doing governance, there's a lot of things that governance can help you achieve. And some of it is the very traditional compliance kind of rules, legal based thing that you look at. So of course, the first thing that governance can help you achieve is around compliance. So things like legal norms or cultural norms or even SOX compliance. But in teams in particular, we find that governance can be really used to help drive adoption. So making sure that you may be using some of the governance policies to remove some of the capabilities from teams, make that interface a little bit easier, and then enable them. The other thing that governance can also help you do is in terms of managing sprawl. It's probably one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing with customers, this idea that there's too much sprawl in teams, right? If you allow people to create teams, they create a whole bunch of crazy teams. We've seen some fascinating names of people creating teams. I think the best team name that we've ever seen is someone created a team called Don't Invite John Here, which is kind of weird, but there we go. Because there was no governance in place, they can do that. Once again, with governance around the creation of teams and the management, you can help manage sprawl. Of course, you can stop information leaks as well. If you're an organization that maybe works in healthcare or is particularly security sensitive, things like credit card numbers, personal information, user data, you can make sure you have governance policies applied to stop all of that. And the other thing as well, which we're really finding organizations using some of those governance capabilities in teams for, is around simplifying the user experience. One of the things you can do is use some of the configuration settings and policies in the Teams Admin Center to actually remove some capabilities within Teams to simplify that experience a little bit. And we'll talk about that also. And really the reason that I think governance is so complex is there's no real right answer. And it's really going to depend on your organization's risk level and where you want to fit, right? So what we tend to say is there's no right answer for every organization, but there probably is a right answer for your organization, right? So where that governance policy is. So in some organizations, you want pretty limited control. And just so you know, if you roll out Teams and you don't change any of the governance policies, you don't go into the Teams Admin Center, you don't change any of these knobs, you are to the far left of this, right? You are in the limited control sort of sphere here, where people can create anything, they can use any applications, whether they're third party or inbuilt. They can essentially do whatever they want, share whatever they want during meetings also. So once again, if you haven't done any governance planning around Teams, this is where you sit. And for a lot of organizations, that might be a bit of a surprise. On the other hand, of course, as well, there's this very tightly controlled mechanism where you might want to control everything that people do in Teams, not just from the process of creation and archival, but even control if people can add tabs or channels or third-party apps or various types of actions they can perform during calls or meetings also. So once again, where you're going to fit is going to depend where that is, but really you want to have some sort of balance, right? You don't want to have everything locked down for your users because then it's a pretty horrible experience and people aren't going to use Teams. And if no one's using Teams, there's no point to have governance because there's nothing to govern, right? So you don't want to go down that route, but you also don't want to go down the route that we've seen traditionally with SharePoint, that if you have self-service site creation for SharePoint sites, people would go and create a bunch of sites and they use them for a couple of minutes and it all becomes useless and it all becomes a huge mess. So there has to be a little bit of a balance there. And like I said, why bother? So the reason that I think you want to implement governance, apart from all of the, the kind of legal stuff, is I think there's just so many options within Teams, right? Teams is a huge product. There's so many capabilities. Without you understanding what you actually want to do and how you want to roll out Teams and the governance policies, it's almost like buying an iPhone. And because you have no idea what people want or what people want to use, you're just going to say, we're just going to download every single app that exists in the Apple App Store and we're just going to let people go at it, right? That's essentially what you're doing if you're not doing any of this governance planning around Teams. You're really allowing people to go and do whatever they want. And like I said, the thing is, what's really nice around Teams governance in particular is there's so many options that are going to be available there, all without any custom code, right? So what I'm going to show you today, there's no need for custom code or PowerShell or any of that type of stuff. So talking about governance in Teams and Microsoft 365 in particular, but concentrating on Teams. how governance is implemented in teams in particular is through the Teams admin center. And there's two types of really things that you have the concept of settings, which are broad level settings applied to everyone. And then you can also have the concept of policy. So for each one of these particular options, you can apply that option to everyone through a setting, but you can also write this through policies, which can be applied to groups or particular users. And the reason that it also gets a little bit complex within Teams in general, just like everything within Microsoft 365, I suppose, is that if we look at the whole set of governance capabilities, some of them you apply to Teams, some of them you apply to groups, and some of them you apply to them through another area, maybe through the Securities and Compliance Center for something like data loss protection. So it gets a little bit complex. There's no one place for like Teams governance, but there is a few places that you have to go to. But just so you know, all those settings are available for you. So in terms of the governance controls in Teams, there is a ton that you can control, and we will go through some of these, but there's a whole range of things that you can do. So I think Chris, before this session, talks all about application permission policies and application setup policies also, right? So this idea that you can control not just the apps that people have available to them in Teams, and by default, every third-party app is available, but you can also use something like an application setup policy to pin apps to particular groups of users for their teams, right? Which is super, super useful, not just from a governance perspective, but even from an adoption perspective. You also have the concept of meeting policies and meeting settings also. You can control what people can do in meetings. What can they share? What guests can do? What guests can't do? The other big thing is really around guest access and external access also. So are you going to allow guests into your teams? If you are, what are some of the rules around that and what they can use as well? But there's a lot of controls available for you to hopefully do what you need to do. When I talk with governance, and there always needs to be a place to start, right? So where we typically start is around these particular 7 items. So the first place really that most organizations start from a governance perspective is who can create teams, right? So who can create teams and SharePoint sites and broadly groups. There's a range of different options around this. But once again, this idea that if we want to really start off with governance, maybe we want to control who can create teams and groups and SharePoint sites. Now, I'm not a huge fan of disabling this for users. I think that users should be able to create teams and groups, but in a lot of cases, either they might need a little bit of training before they can do that, or you might want to help them through the process through something like templates. The next thing is around naming conventions. So making sure that we apply governance to the names that people use when they create teams in particular. So things like prefixes and suffixes are available also. The other things that you can do is things like blocked words. So if you've got particular words that you don't want people to use in team names, you can also block them from doing that. A really good example is making sure that people don't use a privacy within a team name. So if you call in your team, Michael's private project site, it probably doesn't make much sense. A, from a user perspective, but B, if that site changes privacy, then it's going to make less sense as well. Configuring guest access is another one. Huge deal, particularly with the changes that Microsoft is making around essentially enabling guest access by default. So who can add users and guests, the kind of sharing options that you can do. And then later on down the line, we have some of the typically more advanced features. So things like configuring expiration. Microsoft has some really good capabilities in Microsoft 365 that you can set an expiration time limit, let's say 90 days. And if a team hasn't been used for 90 days, it automatically sends an alert to the owner of that particular team. Then we've got some other things, policies and templates. And of course, to monitor all of this as well, it's not a super easy story. There's multiple different areas that you really have to go through to get a really good understanding of what's happening with teams. Some of it's in the Teams Admin Center, some of it's in the Office 365 Admin Center, some of it's in the SharePoint Admin Center. There's a whole bunch of different places. But once again, you can get that information if you need. So now that we understand really quickly a little bit about what governance is from that strategic level, how it's implemented, how would we go around the process of actually doing this implementation? And this is where our governance scenarios are going to come in. So what we're going to do is we are going to pretend we are 3 different organizations with 3 different needs, because like I said, there's no right answer for governance around every organization. So the first one is called Lockdown Corp. Lockdown Corp, super highly, heavily regulated industry dealing with personal identifiable information, or PII, and health data. What they're going to do in each one of these settings, they're going to, in each one of these scenarios, sorry, they're going to lean very close, or very, they're going to lean heavily towards locking everything down, right? That's why they're called Lockdown Corp. They don't want to allow people to do anything. They're going to lock a lot of that down. Balanced industries, they're a little bit more, I guess, balanced, and they want to make sure that whatever governance policies they apply, they want to make sure there's a good balance between the end user needs and also the organizational needs also. And then we've got Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., once again, it's a young company. It's rapid. They have bean bags and free coffee, hipsters running around all over the place. They really want to drive collaboration really, really quickly. So they're going to basically open everything up. Now, a quick tip here. If you've rolled out Teams and you haven't changed any of the out-of-the-box kind of configuration options around policies within the Team Center, you are Startup Inc. Now, I know that shocks a lot of people, but by default, Teams leans really heavily to kind of more of the Startup Inc. scenario where everything is very, very open. That might be shocking to you, but it is, right? So if you can go and add any third-party app from Teams, that basically means you probably haven't changed that configuration option. You are essentially Startup Inc. as well. So it's something to think about also. So let's talk about our first scenario, which is probably the most common one that I think organizations have. Whoops, let's go back here, which is around Teams creation, right? So there's a few decision points that we need to do around this scenario, but really the biggest decision point, and the first one, is who will be able to create groups and teams within your organization. So some of the considerations around this is, of course, limiting the creation of teams can really aid in controlling sprawl and enforcing structure, but it's also going to be at the cost of self-service and probably an additional load on the IT team. So if you're not allowing your users to go and create teams in particular, and you're going through, let's say, an IT process, then that's additional work on the IT team. The really nice thing, though, as well, is if you do allow people to create teams and groups, you want to make sure that you either have really good training in place so people understand what they're doing, or other types of governance. That could be a third-party tool, that could be training that people go through, or that could be essentially anything else that you need through that. Now, the nice thing around this as well, in terms of teams creation, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do out of the box. Of course, you can use third-party tools, but there's also a bunch of tools that Microsoft have provided, or you can build your own in Flow and Power Apps also, which is a pretty popular thing. So in terms of controlling teams creation, how is this going to look like for our three different organizations? So let's talk about Lockdown Corp. Now, unsurprisingly, Lockdown Corp is going to disable the creation of teams through the native UI, and they're not really going to allow anyone to create anything, but it has to go through a third-party tool so IT can have complete approval of anything that is created. Now, once again, this could be something that your organization does, but if you want to go down very restrictive settings, you can do that. Balanced Industries does something a little bit different, and something that we're seeing more and more often. So Balanced Industries allows some people to create teams through the native interface. And the way that they do that is, before someone goes and creates their first team, what's going to happen is they're going to have to go undertake a little bit of training, right? And once they understand what a team is, maybe they have to do a little bit of a test, maybe it's only a 30-minute or a 50-minute thing, then they can go into a group which they can go and start requesting teams from. This is something that we're seeing more and more often. It's a really nice balanced approach, where, once again, if someone wants to create a team, maybe they go through a little bit of training so they understand what it is, and then they go through that particular process and get their team on the other side. And then Startup Inc., they're pretty happy. So Startup Inc. is going to allow anyone to create anything. Once again, this is the out-of-the-box option. If you haven't done any governance planning or any governance implementation, literally anyone is going to be able to create anything. And that's what Startup Inc. is going to allow people to do. The next one we want to quickly talk about is around default and available apps, right? So the decision point around this is, which apps do we want to give our users access to? And also, which apps do we want to default for our users? Now, strangely enough, This is such a powerful capability, not just from a governance perspective, so you can control the types of apps that people add, but also from an adoption perspective. Because what's really interesting around this is you can maybe pin particular apps for particular groups of users, so they don't have to go and add those. Now, a couple of things that you want to consider, or some considerations around this. Firstly, what apps from the Teams App Store do you want to make available for your users to use? You can also control not just third-party apps, but what are called custom apps. So these are applications that are typically developed within your organization. You can control whether people can add those and use those also. Now, one of the things that you might want to be able to do is maybe remove some of the default apps that come with Microsoft Teams. Maybe you don't want to have like the Files app there, or maybe the Calls tab. You can remove it, but all it does, it just removes it to the bottom of those dots there. So it doesn't really do what you might think what you might think it does. But this is a super powerful capability. Now, the way that this is implemented is a little bit tricky, but it's still pretty easy. It's a combination of an application setup policy, an application permission policy, and then finally an organizational wide app settings also. So let's go through some scenarios here. So let's talk about what Lockdown Corp wants to do with their default and available apps. So Lockdown Corp, as you probably quite likely assume, they want to remove any access to any third-party apps. As far as Lockdown Corp's concerned, there's not going to be anyone being able to use any of those third-party apps. They don't want to allow users to add any personal apps either, or custom apps, and they don't want to allow users to pin apps also. What Lockdown Corp wants to do is to say, here are the apps, this is the only thing that you can use, and this is the only experience that you're essentially going to have. So the way the Lockdown Corp's going to do that is in their organizational wide settings. From the third-party apps, they're going to disallow third-party apps. They're also going to disallow any apps that should be published to the App Store by default. So one of the interesting things is not only can you block third-party apps at a point in time, but you can also block any third-party apps that are then released afterwards. They're also not allowing people to use custom apps also. Hang on, let me get the old laser pointer here. This thing's awesome. There we go. So they're also going to remove that. In terms of the application permission policy, they're going to block all of the Microsoft apps. Now, when this says blocking the Microsoft apps, it's not blocking the ones like Word and SharePoint and all of those. It's some of the other ones that Microsoft publishes. Also, they're going to block third-party apps, and they're going to block custom apps. And the other thing the Lockdown Corp is going to do as well is they're not going to allow people to upload their own custom apps or even pin apps, right? So you can even stop people from pinning those apps on those left-hand side or changing the order. Basically, this is what people get, right? So not probably the best experience for your users, but hey, it's Lockdown Corp. No one said they're going to be a fun organization to work at or with, and they really want that complete control. The next thing that we have is Balanced Industries. So what Balanced Industries wants to do is they want to allow people to add third-party apps, but not all of them, right? So they know there's some third-party applications that people use within Teams, but they don't want to allow people to add anyone. The other thing that they also want to do is they have a solution for engagement and governance, and they want to pin that to everyone's Teams. So as soon as they log in, people are going to have access to that application. So how's that going to work? So firstly, in the org-wide settings, they're going to allow third-party apps. They're going to disallow this as well. So this is kind of interesting. I talked about this as well. Not only are they allowing some of the third-party apps, but they're going to disallow third-party apps which are being published after this particular date. They're going to allow people to have interaction with custom apps also, because maybe they've got a few custom solutions that they've built internally in-house, which they want their users to have access to. From the application permission policy, they're going to allow all of the Microsoft apps, so they're pretty good with any of the Microsoft stuff. For the third-party apps, they're going to block all of the others, but they're going to allow the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and also Stack Overflow for Teams. And the reason that they're essentially doing that is they know that people are going to use those Teams, going to use those apps, especially the marketing people. They love Adobe Creative Cloud. So what they want to do is basically allow those. And then they're also going to add a custom app, which is pinned to there. They're going to allow user pinning. They're going to pin this app through here. So every time someone logs on, they're going to have that app ready to go, right? So this is a nice balanced approach of not everything, but just a couple of things available there. And of course, startup industries, they're just going to use the default option. And like I said before, the default option is all of the third-party apps are available, Custom apps are available, all of the Microsoft apps, third-party apps, custom apps, and people can do whatever they want through here. Like I've said time and time again, if you haven't made any changes in the admin center, you are Startup Inc., or you have everything available for you. Next thing that we want to talk about is teams' naming policies. So naming policies, you want to enforce conventions on how teams and groups are named, because if you know, people tend to name things a little bit crazy. If you don't believe me, go into anyone's file share and you'll see everyone has their own kind of way of naming teams and files. That really doesn't work, particularly with teams. If everything is called different, difficult then to find teams or search for teams or do all of that sort of stuff as well. Now, the nice thing around this is there is some capabilities that Microsoft provides around team and group naming. I don't think they're personally that useful or that good, but they are available, and it's going to give you more than nothing also. So once again, some of the considerations are around this. You can have things called prefixes and suffixes. So maybe the prefix could be before someone creates a team. There's some sort of identifier that is added to there. You can also have blocked words also. Unfortunately, there's no real good way to stop a team owner after they've created a team, either with a naming policy, to then go and change the name. And just so you know, this is a feature that requires Azure AD Premium P1, right? So you might not have this within your organization, or you might. It really depends, but it's not like a standard E3 sort of feature that most organizations get. So how do these naming policies look like, and what are some examples of naming policies that we have seen work within organizations? So for project teams and sites, we see a really good naming convention or naming policy work that you might prepend any project team with PRJ to indicate it's a project. Then you might have the project ID and then the descriptive name of that site. So then if anyone's looking for a project, if they find a team that has PRJ prepended, to that, they know it's automatically a project team. For departments, the same sort of thing. Maybe you have DEPT, maybe a classification around that, and then the department name. The other thing we also see is we see a lot of organizations are allowing naming policies to tell people whether external users or guest users are part of this team, right? This is really because it can be a little bit tricky to see if guests are part of a team, especially if you're new to teams. We are seeing a lot of organizations actually adding, EXT or guest as part of that team itself. If you're a multinational, for instance, and you're a large organization, you might have possibly thousands of teams. So the ability to maybe add a geography or a business unit, and then the descriptive name is super useful. And then the other one which I found as well was from Harvard, the university. What they use is they put the organizational or the school name, then a dash, then the department, and then the descriptive name. Now, what this all does is it just really helps to quickly at a glance understand what the context of these teams are for. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a bunch of teams. Now, thankfully, these teams haven't been called anything too crazy. So these are actually decent naming examples. We've got the Market Project team, we've got the Digital Initiative for Public Relations, Retail, Contoso, Sales and Marketing. But then on the left-hand side, now we have these naming conventions applied. So I can instantly tell that the Contoso team is for the USA HR department. We can tell that this is a department team that has external users available. We've also got a couple of department teams as well, or 3 of them, and then all of these are projects, which is super useful. And instantly I know PRJ project ID. I might not know what the project ID is, but at least I know that it's a project. So it's a really, really simple, subtle thing, but once again, it can be incredibly useful. So one more thing we're going to go through: team owners and members settings. So this is the other thing that's really, really important. It's the idea of what do we want to allow the members in particular of teams to be able to do. So it's not really around owners or around guests. We're going to talk about members in particular. And interesting, there's a whole range of things and nuance that you can do depending on your governance policies, right? So let's talk about these really, really quickly. So the first one is in Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp, as you probably would have guessed by now, wants to lock everything down. So what Lockdown Corp wants to do is to control what members do in teams. So they disable pretty much everything in terms of member permissions. So the only thing a member can do in a team of Lockdown Corp They can't create and update channels. They can't remove apps. They can't add tabs. They can't add connectors. They even can't delete or edit the messages or the posts that they put within that team, right? They even can't do that. They can put posts in. They can upload documents, right? They can basically use the structure of that team. But once again, this is an example of a governance policy being applied. So Lockdown Corp is going to lock everything down. Balance Industries, a little bit different. So what Balance Industries want to do is they want to allow team members to essentially go and they can add tabs, they can add connectors, they can go and edit their messages, but they don't want to allow team members to actually be able to go and change the structure of the team. And by the structure of the team, I mean the channels, right? So they don't want team members to go in, start creating a bunch of random channels because maybe they have a really good structure around those teams. They want to leave that responsibility to the team's owners. So what they're actually going to do is they're going to remove the ability for members to create and update channels. They're going to allow, they're not going to allow members to delete or restore channels or remove apps or to upload custom apps. Really interesting approach, right? So now you've got this approach where essentially those team owners are essentially stewards of that team. They provide the structure to then when the members can go and start using it. So this is an interesting approach. This is one we're seeing more and more often organizations, more and more organizations use, simply because a lot of the time we're finding that people don't really understand what Teams channels are. So a person that's new to Teams, they just go in, they start banging in a bunch of channels, and then everything goes a little bit crazy there. So you can control that as well. And then Startup Inc. What's Startup Inc. going to do? Startup Inc. members are going to be able to do anything. Remember, if you haven't changed anything, you are Startup Inc. In Startup Inc., members can go and create channels and update things and make things and do essentially whatever they want through here also. So from the Startup Inc. Standpoint, once again, they can do that as well. Now, one more thing we're going to quickly blast through here before we get into some questions. Let's talk about some Teams meeting settings also. So in terms of Teams meetings, lots and lots of options around this. And really, we're just going to talk about a subset of this around content sharing and guests. So the decision points around your Teams meetings are how will users be able to share content and what type of content they can share during a Teams meetings, and what should guests be able to do during a team meeting. Now, just so you know, there's a bunch of other settings and policies you can apply to your Teams meetings to control exactly what people can do, what people can share, and everything else. Now, the reason that we do this, particularly around Teams meeting and content sharing, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's typically a lot of data loss that can occur during a Teams meeting. So I'll give you a really good example. I'm sharing my desktop here at the moment, right? If I don't really know what I'm doing, maybe I'm working on a spreadsheet which has everyone's salaries on it, and that's been recorded. And when I like Alt-Tab through here, right, I accidentally go and that kind of salary spreadsheet flashes up for a brief second, and then, you know, there's a little bit of trouble there. So once again, you can actually control what people can share through here as well. So let's go and look at these as well. So once again, in terms of meeting settings, there's two things that you want to use. There's the setting, and there's also meeting policies. And there's lots more in meeting policies than just these two options, but we'll just talk about these two. So in terms of Lockdown Corp, same sort of thing. We've talked about Lockdown Corp before. They've had issues in the past with data leaks during meetings, so they're understandably hesitant. What they want to do, they don't want to allow anonymous users to join the meetings. And in terms of sharing, they're only going to allow people to share a PowerPoint slide. Now, you might not think this is possible, but it is. What they're going to do is that they're going to disable screen sharing mode here. Let's get the odd laser pointer. They're going to disable screen sharing mode. They're not going to allow participants to request control of someone else's screen. They're not going to allow the whiteboard. They're going to get rid of shared notes. The only thing people can share is a PowerPoint slide. I know you might think this is strange. There's a lot of organizations that actually do this, right? That they don't want people to share anything else just to make sure that everything's secure. And in terms of the guests, they're not going to allow anonymous people to share a meeting. They can automatically admit people. They're not going to allow users to bypass the lobby and all of this sort of stuff as well. They're even not going to allow live captions or chat in meetings also. So once again, there's pretty locked down scenario, but you do have that option there. The next thing is, Balance Industries. So Balance Industries, like I said, Balance Industries, what they want to do, they're a little bit more open. So they're going to allow people to, instead of doing a screen sharing mode of the screen, they're going to allow people to share a single application at a time. Once again, that can solve some of these challenges in terms of data leaks. They're going to allow people, internal users only, to request or give access control, but they're not going to allow external people in the meeting to request or give access control, right? So you can control that as well. They're going to allow PowerPoint, whiteboard, and the shared notes. In terms of the participants and guests, they're going to allow anonymous people to start a meeting. They're automatically going to admit people. They're going to allow meet now in private meetings, and they're going to allow people to have live captions and chat in meetings also. Finally, we have Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., once again, this is the default option here. Startup Inc. is going to allow everyone to essentially do everything through here as well. So once again, a couple of settings there. Hopefully this concept of, those 3 different scenarios and all of those options makes sense. So just to finish this up here, in terms of Teams governance, once again, really the idea with Teams governance is it should be used to empower and control your organization and your end users, right? I think it's really up to us, particularly if you work in an IT role, to make sure that whatever governance policies you are applying, particularly within Teams, it's a balance, right? You want to give people enough capabilities that they can do what they need, but you also want to make sure that you have enough control there. Hopefully the other thing is you've seen just how much control you have, right, within Microsoft Teams and just within that Teams Admin Center. We've probably covered 1/100th of the options that you have available here, but you have a lot of options that are available both at the organizational level, at the group level, and at the individual user level that you can apply there. And the final thing is, if you've rolled out Teams and you haven't changed any of those options, just remember, you are Startup Inc. You're essentially allowing people to do anything within Microsoft Teams that they want. Now, maybe that's exactly what you want and what you need, but maybe that's not. So what I would encourage you is also to maybe have a look at some of the settings, some of the policies that you might want to apply, and make sure that if you're not Startup Inc., that you provide those pieces there. So with that, I know we're a little bit over time here. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully that was useful. I know that was very kind of quick fire sort of presentation. I'll hang around here for a couple of minutes if anyone's got any question. I know it's also like 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so probably some of you are in the middle of eating lunch. So once again, thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any questions, then please let me know. Otherwise, feel free to reach out. If you're interested in anything that I have to say, follow me on Twitter at Michal Pisarek, or also you can just get in touch with me as well. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.